they will destroy the parrots. So not a good idea. But yeah, I like parrots, particularly African parrots.
I think Dennis is ready, guys. You may not, but Dennis is ready.
I'm ready.
I hope you guys are ready too, because we're about to embark on
a mathematical
crazy
journey.
Yeah, another mathematical journey.
I have a proposal before we start. I think we need to talk about an atomic threshold, meaning a certain resolution of this stuff that if we go below it, if we go below it to the subatomic level, we stop out of fear for nuclear fission and other dangerous effects. Because I know that from the last two meetings, I'm seeing that there's so much stuff here to look into that we might like go zoom in indefinitely, you know?
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
I just worry because, I mean, it can also get in the way of the rest of your presentation.
No, I completely agree.
Should we have a safe word?
Yeah, should we have a safe word?
Like pineapple.
Pineapple.
But can I ask you, like, for somebody who's new to all this and new to what Badiou is doing with this, stylistically, why do you think Badiou has abandoned all the mathematical jargon or the common names in mathematics in this case, in favor of something that he devised himself? Like, for example, I was reading on the topic of central object and the references to central objects, and omega and x of f and all that. Even in his mathematics of transcendence, he's talking about mathematics and he's using different names and different references. Why do you think he did that? I mean, was it not, I mean, this stuff is new enough, and he's trying hard for the reader to understand it. Would it not be easier for even his purpose, for people to understand this, to stay closer to the mathematical jargon? I mean, not that changing C with omega is going to make all of a sudden the concept of central object easier to understand. You know what I'm saying?
Maybe it's because of the criticisms he got apropos the phrase mathematics is ontology. Because you remember in the introduction to Being an Event, he talks about how the history of mathematics is the history of ontology, and because of the history of mathematics continues, the history of ontology will continue, kind of, not indefinitely, but in this sense. Maybe that's why he wants to change the focus from the history of mathematics to new concepts that he designed.
I just think, like, also there's also a very strong need to distinguish between extensional differences in ontology and the sort of difference of appearance, right? The differences that appear in a world. I mean, it's a philosophical decision that there is a different type of
But Dennis, the vocabulary is kind of different enough already, isn't it? I mean, functions and functors, categories and sets. These are all different vocabularies. Maybe he wants to embed in his vocabulary the philosophical purpose already. This is a good, maybe a good hypothesis, but it's hard to confuse such things, right? Mm-hmm. Even within the mathematical vocabulary, which is designed to have, you know, a maximal definition, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of weird, but I understand something along the lines of what you both are saying, that maybe he wants to already embed this vocabulary into his philosophical project in some way. If you read Mathematics of the Transcendental, which is kind of his notebooks while he's learning this stuff, really learning and teaching, right? He's not just learning category theory. He's already comparing two different ontologies, and he's treating them as two competing ontologies, not as ontology versus phenomenology. Because this was, I think, the critique he got from Desanti, right? Like, you could have started from a different mathematical basis. If you had started with this new thing, you would arrive at something quite different in terms of ontology. So I think he's probing into that hypothesis in the first book of Mathematics of the Transcendental.
But isn't Reza's commentary like, why change the name of the terms, right?
Yeah, I mean, he even changes the symbols. Like in Mathematics of Transcendence, we have, when he's talking about exponents, there are a whole bunch of elaboration in order to show exponents or exponentiation in category theory. You guys probably remember that. It's very difficult to show exponentiation. Like
this is one of the hardest chapters of that first
right.
book.
I mean, every term that is in the standard literature, he's inventing something else for it. Yeah. And then if you look at like Wikipedia and stuff like that, you see the standard terms, and then you have to transpose. A lot of times I find what is in the Wikipedia easier to understand, more comprehensive.
Yeah. I have a theory on this that actually I think I understand, or I explain this justify this to myself by combining two premises that I think are both quite legitimate, but they have kind of side effects. The first, let's say more intra-philosophical, is that I think that he wants to give a minimal distinction between mathematics as a generic procedure where terms operate in a certain way as part of mathematical practice, and mathematics as the sort of something that secretes ontological information despite itself. So I think he tries to manage that difference a bit. And sometimes when there are good names in philosophy for stuff in the mathematics he's using, he prefers that. In Immanence of Truth, this is very clear because there's a moment that he pardons himself, like he asks for, like, he says, I'm like, kind of against my common sense, I'm gonna keep the term in the mathematical term rather than find the philosophical one, like for ultra filters. He says, rather than find a philosophical substitute, I'm gonna keep the mathematical one. So you can see that it's a clear decision to substitute, because when he doesn't, he actually mentions it, Mm-hmm. But I think that the second point, and I think that if you try to present this stuff to anyone that is not a nerd like we are, like if you actually try, Caron knows that I've had some experience presenting Badiou for other people. People who not necessarily are interested in the formalism, or people who are averse to it. Like, there is a very clear use of changing this stuff. Like, I think we should really think about what it means to have such a complicated presentation on topos theory, sheaves, things like this, in a book that barely mentions the word sheaves, topos categories, or anything like this. Like, the guy is able to transmit a lot of content without almost any of these concepts, and then it kind of plays against him, because then he has formal chapters where he wants to prove to you that he's not taking it out of your head, and then he's kind of in a pickle because he already committed to that philosophical distancing of mathematics, and to, I think, a very strong didactic sense that these books are not meant for nerds. They are supposedly meant for anyone, right? Okay, perhaps a French sense of anyone.
We were having the same conversation like 10 minutes ago.
But I think that it's a deformation that he is very aware of. That, I mean, he's not a show-off, right? He's not a guy who says, look how much mathematics I know. And he's actually quite worried about making it disappear.
But he is not a show-off?
of mathematics. No, he's a show off of. I mean, I think that would be a small ambition for him. Like
exactly.
yeah, like that's petty. Like to show that I know topo theory. That's kind of let the haters hate, right? And he just
that's below him.
that's below him. He wants to solve, what a world is for.
Yeah, like complete the system of German idealism. Like
Yeah, he wants to complete the system of if you
not Trump, but Badiou.
Yeah, if you ask him, do you want to complete? He would say yes. Like, of course. So, but I think that part of what allows him to be so ambitious philosophically is that he's very, I mean, he has that sort of idea that it should address itself to anyone. So I think that those two things really govern his decisions. Like, don't go into, like, it's not about the formalism. So the formalism is always separate. It's always a separate chapter. It's all introduced, never first, always after something else. And that thing that comes before is always with a small distance from the formalism, right? It's always like change of concept. So I think the combination of these two things makes it easier for people who are really afraid of these topics. It makes it hard for people who are curious about them. Like for people who are curious.
But at the same time, yeah, but at the same time, I understand Reza's worry, because why not? Okay, you want to use your own vocabulary, but why not indicate the standard vocabulary, right? I mean, maybe
gives you the references. Like, you can go look. I mean,
yeah, it takes work though. It takes work. I mean, it's not given to you on a platter. You have to go and like browse Cat Lab or ask people, and like over time you assemble
he
a dictionary.
does that a lot. He does that a lot. I've been reading his published seminars in French for the last couple of weeks. He does that a lot to students as well.
Does what?
He talks about, I don't know, a topic where he compares his conception of something and Deleuze's conception of something. He explains Deleuze's conception, and rather than explaining his own conception, he says, for this you can look at being an event, go look, I'm not going to explain it here. then he moves on.
Yeah, I mean, I find it healthy. Perhaps it's me rationalizing it, but I like the idea that this book is not meant for me. Like that the commitments that organize the presentation of his work are not the commitments that make me the ideal reader. Like, overly zealous, concerned with the explicitation of stuff in their original version. Of course, I'm interested in all of that, but I think that if he were to think of himself in this way, kind of living up to that standard, I think he would conceive of himself as a smaller philosopher. And I think that he thinks he's doing something that is like meant to make people who have no interest in set theory become interested, no interest in category theory to become interested. Like I think he puts
I think
the thing
Gabriel,
this is a communist injunction.
I think so.
He tries to make category theory serve the people, right? Maoism in its ultimate form.
I really think that. I honestly think that. I really do think
but
that.
You know,
I don't think he succeeds every time, but
the thing is that, in fact, when you compare two projects that I have familiarity with, Being an Event and now Logics of Words, his commitment to the mathematics, the underlying mathematics in Being an Event, is unambiguous, and he remains unambiguous. He keeps saying set theory, he keeps referring to the axioms, he even lists the axioms. He goes to the mathematical jargon, he replicates very, very minimally, like instead of the name generic, he uses sometimes indiscernible or vice versa. But his commitment to the underlying mathematics is as if that he feels at home in set theory stuff, and he remains like that even. But it feels like for him that he doesn't feel at home with category theory or the concepts or the jargon. And he feels that he has to create a more, what do you call it, more like keep distance with this jargon and just use it as he feels is necessary for this. I don't know. Don't you feel that way?
I think we can interpret that in a similar manner, like what Gabriel said about him trying to make category theory serve the people, right? Maybe he thinks people are maybe more acquainted with, or people may understand better set theory and set theory language than category theory language.
I
Maybe
think there is a bit to that. And I mean, the main reason why I say this is not either being an event or logic of roles, but immanence of truth. Because immanence of truth is like the most relaxed thing Badiou has ever written. Like, I'm sure he wrote it using like sandals, you know, like just gonna, you know, write a bit and then go to the beach, come back, like watch some Netflix. Like, it's very chill for such a huge book about the absolute, you know? And the formalisms, they look a bit like Logics of Worlds. There is a very angry review written by one of his disciples, Justin Clemens, about Logics of Worlds, where he complains. He says, this book was written by somebody who thought like they knew they were on the spotlight. Like, being an event was written by like the underdog. Nobody knew who Badiou was.
That's kind of interesting, his observation.
Yeah, he says like Badiou puts demonstration in the middle of the text. Like, he's trying to cover too much into little. I'm deeply dissatisfied with the book. Like, he was really pissed. Part of it, it's a bit weird, the review, but I think many people notice that there's something strange about Logics of Worlds, and I agree that it's very restrictive, but while like many mathematicians said it's unnecessarily restrictive due to the mathematics, and other people thought it was restrictive because the book could be much more explicit and long and clear. I think that if you look at where he went afterwards, which is even more kind of like, he still provides all the formulas and all the results. Like, there are long passages about this intricate kind of results from large cardinals theory and so on, but it's very similar to Logics of Worlds in this.
I've heard it's even harder, formalist stuff.
Yes.
Logics of Worlds.
Yes, it's much harder. It's much harder, I think. But it's like, I think he takes a lot of like rhetorical pleasure in the fact that it's meant for anyone, right? Like, how this translates into the rhetorics of the text, it's not always good, but I do think that's a commitment that distorts the presentations, even at the expense of making it look unrigorous or unnecessarily cryptic from the perspective of the rigorous formulation of stuff. I think that that's a relevant commitment. It surely doesn't explain everything, but I do think that it's relevant. And trying to present Badiou to others, I mean, the guy always, I mean, the fact that he divided his books, every book is divided between conceptual and formal, and he always has a preface saying you don't need to read the formal, but it's there if you want. It takes effort and things like this. Like, I don't think that he counts with the reader who is mathematically informed and who's gonna trace all the details. I think he counts with the reader who's gonna leave it at where he presented it, and his concern is more with the guy following up to the level that he presented than using it as a springboard for further development, you know?
Yeah, but he doesn't do it for being an event. So with being an event, so anyway, I mean,
he changes the formalism for generic subsets, for ontological rank.
But like even in the introduction to being an event, he says something similar, right? He says like there are multiple combinations with which you can read the book.
Yeah, he likes that. Yeah, I agree with you that that being an event perhaps is more. I do think that it was less of a acrobatic movement to relate stuff. Like, he now needs to pick and choose from category theory with regards to previous commitments to set theory. When he presented being an event, he didn't have that extra commitment, right? Like it didn't have to match with anything previous. Like this time he needs it. I think that he has, let's say, also, I think that this part might be a relevant thing. Like he has, he knows that there are interlocutors, especially of a Deleuzian kind of background, who are interested in category theory for other reasons, as a sort of general ontology. And I think that he makes the purposeful decision also to empty out the diagrammatic from category, right? Theory. Like he avoids it at the more he can. He doesn't really link it back like explicitly to stuff that could kind of open up to a Deleuzian reinterpretation of everything he's doing. Like the whole book is a discussion on with Spinoza and body and on like this chapter on relation is like a big slap in the face of relational ontology in a certain sense. So there's also that, you know, perhaps that's also relevant.
Yeah, I don't want to take away. I mean, we have a lot to cover.
Sorry,
I wanted to leave one thought. Maybe we can come back to it later, or we can so basically.
Yeah, I actually have one comment on this before we move on. I think we can actually use Badiou's own theory to describe why he, or at least give a justification for why he uses different terms. We could think that there's two worlds. There's Badiou's world, in which the terms, the language of category theory, for example, is indexed. And we have the world of, let's say, standard mathematical exposition, which is another world. And categories are indexed there as well, right? And then it's the same multiple, right? The same thought is being thought in both places. But indexed, to say that it's been indexed differently, appears differently, it's kind of like saying, you know, Badiou's choosing his own atoms to, you know, kind of recast it. Also because he says in Being an Event, like he doesn't want to be confused with being a philosopher of mathematics, right? So if he were to say, oh, a world is a topos, and this is what a topos is, and he gives you the standard definition and so on.
That actually is a crucial part. I think that's true.
Yeah. Then if he says this is this and this is this, and he just gives you a dictionary. Okay, all my concepts can be found in these standard expositions. Then you're measuring his concepts from the world of mathematics, rather than measuring the mathematics from his world.
But isn't that sophistry?
No, why is it sophistry?
Why?
It's a different world.
But if we just say that, like, so my question is, what is wrong to say word is topos? So what? I mean, if he says that if people conceive him as a philosopher of mathematics, but that's one thing that he doesn't want. That's his desire. But what's wrong to say, really, the concept of world that I'm employing is the concept of set according to category theory, and it's called a topos, and these are the properties of topos, and these are the reasons for which I think it works for the word of appearing.
Yeah, I don't think he hides. He doesn't.
No,
it's not like he's hiding that.
That explicit sentence is there, in fact.
Yeah, he says all these things. I'm just saying that that's not the main focus.
Yeah.
Like when I say if you index the same multiple in a different world, that doesn't mean you hide the multiple. It just means it has a different transcendental value. Like the exposition gives it its weight.
Yeah.
Right. His ideas give those concepts a different weight.
Yeah, and I honestly, actually, I think that Being an Event was charged with the same critique, because why did he call power sets the state of the situation?
Yeah.
So like that's the main critique. So I mean.
Yeah, but he doesn't hide the fact that I am calling power set the state. He says that. He says what is a power set.
Yeah, but what is the concept that is hidden here? Like what is the thing that is hidden?
I don't think he's hiding anything in Logic's worlds. It It isn't front and center, that's true, but it's not hidden. It's in there, like transcendental functor. He just put it at the end in the scholium, but it wasn't hidden.
Yeah, I just think that, I mean, as people interested in the mathematics behind it, it gets a bit annoying that you have to do so much work. But I think that, first of all, category theory is also a much more complicated labyrinth than ZFC. Like, it's like I'm tired of looking at like introductions to set theory, and they're all the same. But I cannot find two websites that present category theory the same way. Like,
Yeah, you tell me.
so it's,
So
I mean,
we may actually think of it like Minos' slave, right? So Socrates demonstrates that even a slave can do mathematics, geometry, yada yada yada. Maybe it's easier for the slave to do set theory, but if you need to do category theory, maybe you need Badiou's dictionary. Maybe that's what you think.
What the thought that I wanted to leave, and we can move on, is as I read through mathematics of transcendence, and I have the passage you translated, Gabriel, and you put it on our website in the back of my mind when I say this, but it feels to me that at least back in 2008, when he was writing, 2003, when he was writing this, I think he was not fully committed to category theory, or at least so he's writing in a style as if he wants to keep his distance, just in case that maybe it is because of his earlier full commitment to set theory, and then they said, what are you talking about? Look at category theory. This is way more elaborated than set theory. Then he kind of had to backpedal and away from his full commitment to set theory. Maybe that experience kept him, but I feel a little bit of hesitation in his prose, in his approach to the whole thing. But again, I may be wrong. You guys have dealt with it for a lot longer. It's just a thought that I want to leave, and we can come back to it.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's important to think about.
yeah, I agree.
Yeah, we can't answer it now though. Okay, so let's start. So last time we went through basic definitions of category, functors, duality, and natural transformations. I don't know how clear it was, but I wrote another presentation to cover relations from the actual book, so I want to get to that. I think, along with what Gabriel was saying, I think we should try to maybe not get too lost in the details on it, because each one of these concepts goes very deep. The point of introducing, at least for this presentation, the point of introducing these concepts is so that we can get to Yoneda lemma, so we can kind of get a high-level summary of what category theory is about, in a way. The perspective of category theory as a whole. I think that perspective is captured in the Yoneda lemma, and it involves the language of natural transformations and functors. So we need to use what we previously had discussed, right? So recall that for any category, we have a category of pre-sheaves. Pre-sheaves are functors. And when you write this notation, this means you have a functor, you have a category of functors, and the functors go from the thing on the left to the thing on the right. Okay, so the tricky thing here is to think, okay, objects make sense. Objects are just points in some abstract space in some sense, right? But then we introduce morphisms, and then we introduce functors that change one category to another category. Now we have to treat the functors themselves as if they were the points. Okay, that's what this signifies. Okay, so
sorry, can you go to the previous slide and review the concept of pre-sheaves? Just
okay. So basically the pre-sheaf idea, we covered it, I think, here. So basically these things are representable functors, right? Okay, so let's bring up this thing. So we have these things in a category, right? Objects and arrows. And then we said that basically these arrows they're a diagrammatic tool for us, but really they represent a collection of morphisms. So we said that actually behind every arrow is a set. Well, if it's locally small, right? We could say more generally it's a collection, but if we ignore the size issue here, we say behind every arrow there's a set of morphisms, right? Then we said, oh, well, we can actually free up one of these terms and turn this set into a functor, right? And there's two ways. We said we could either free up the first term or the second term, right? So we do this, or we can do this, right? And you know, in the actual thing that I showed you, both of them have a in them, but this is a functor because when I free up one of the parameters, that means this now takes an object from the category and returns a set. Does that make sense? Like this term, because I draw this line here, means that it can take any object. It's not fixed to B anymore. Because it can take any object, that means it maps some category, which looks like this, let's say. This thing now maps it to the world of sets. Right, this is the functor, like this, right? Okay, so the functor itself is this, and we say that any presheaf which is isomorphic to this functor is called a representable presheaf. Right, so this is kind of the form of the presheaf, not this one, because this is actually a co-presheaf because it's covariant. This is the presheaf, representable presheaf. Right, there's other presheafs, but when they are isomorphic to something like this, it's called a representable presheaf. Okay.
Good, thank you.
Yeah.
But isn't a necessary condition for a presheaf to have to carry some information to the category of sets? From what I understand, you have the category. It goes from the category of categories, right, into the category of sets specifically, which in the codomain it's contravariant in relationship to the domain, right? I mean, you have all the arrows are in the different direction in the codomain.
Yes, that's an important part about presheaves. Yes, so in the original category C, we had our central element, let's call it B, and then we had arrows going into B from other ones, like call it A1, A2, and so on, right? So what happens when we use the functor here? What this does is it takes, for any of it, the first term, it maps it to the set that represents the transformations between those two terms. So let's say I choose A1 here. Then I have the set of maps from A1 to B. Right, so here's hom A1 B, and then hom A2B, and so on, right? So the key with the contravariance here comes in because if you have another arrow here, let's call it C1. This will actually, because this goes C1 to A1, this one goes A1 back to C1. So let's make that a little more clear. Contravariance basically means that the arrows are flipped, right? So if for every, and remember that functors map objects to new objects, but they map arrows to new arrows such that the composition is maintained.
You have a structure preserving mapping, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is different from a function. From what I've read, pre-sheaf is it's completely correct. I'm just complementing what you say. From what I read, intuitive way of understanding pre-sheaves is to have like a mirror image of a composition within categories, within sets. Because it is a mirror image, it is contravariant. Like you have the same composition in sets with flipped arrows, right? And the arrows are not functors; they are generic functions between the sets.
Yes, exactly. So that would be, yeah, these are the generic functions, set functions. So yeah, if we were to call this F and G here, F, and then this thing would be G follow F, right? This thing gets mapped to this arrow. But then this is called the restriction. So yeah, maybe it's hard to see from this picture here, but the arrows get flipped because originally C1 goes to B here, but this goes from B back to C1.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the arrows were flipped. This is a restriction map, and then this is the inclusion map.
Maybe you should draw the mirror image to be clearer, perhaps.
Yeah, that's probably. Yeah, so we have A1 B, and then C1 B, and then we want to restrict those. So okay, so let's think about this. Okay, yeah, this is mapped to B, B. So this maps this to this, and it maps this here, and it maps C1 here, okay? So functors map objects to sets here, representable functors, right? Then it also needs to map these functions as well. So functions, or sorry, morphisms on the left need to be mapped to functions on the right. So G gets mapped here. Okay. And F is mapped here. Yeah, so actually I drew this wrong. This is actually the composition.
Yeah, and if the functions are transitive, the composition holds also in the mirror image, right? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So this is how it looks completely. Yeah. Okay, it doesn't look exactly like a mirror image, but just use some imagination that the arrows were pointing towards B, now they're pointing away from B, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm reading from your page 27, a functor F from co-opposite to D is considered contravariant with respect to C, which is the original category. Not if D is the category of sets, then F is considered the presheaf duality. So, so the functor is taking what is in the mirror image of a category into a set, which you explained is when you flip the first element of hom function to a dash, right? That's the meaning of taking that to a set, right?
Yeah. When I freed up one of the parameters, I turned this into a functor.
Not a parameter, the first parameter.
Yeah, but I mean, you could also take out the second parameter and also make it a functor. It just would not be a presheaf. It would be
it would not be a presheaf. Okay.
Yeah.
So in order for it to be a contravariant, you have to also flip the first one.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
The first one makes it contravariant. Yeah.
Okay. If D is the category of sets, then F is considered a presheaf. Dually, a functor F from a category to set is a co-presheaf. Okay.
Right. Yeah. So there are other things that will map to the category of sets. And those are just presheaves in general, if they're contravariant. So yeah, basically anything that's contravariant to set is a presheaf. Now I'm saying that this thing is a restriction or a specialization of presheaf to only what's called representable. Okay, and the Yoneda lemma is going to explain why these are special, right? These basically contain all the information that one needs to know about B. Okay, so we have this category of presheaves. So a category of presheaves would be basically a category where you have these hom dash Bs, and then B can change, right? So you would have, so this now I'm describing the category C opposite set, okay? Each one of the objects here is like this thing. Hom B, hom dash C, hom dash A, okay? You can see that in the original category, so this is C op set. In the original category, we had just B, C, A like that, right? And some arrows between them. So what's called the Yoneda embedding simply maps an object here to the appropriate functor over here. So this is called the Yoneda embedding. Okay. So this is another type of functor because it took objects in one category and it mapped them to another category. In this case, the category called the category of presheaves. Okay. And this is what this describes here. So what the Yoneda lemma says is that the set of natural transformations from the embedding of an object C to any other set value presheaf is isomorphic to the value of C under that presheaf. What that means is this green stuff that I drew here, this is one functor. And if I were to make another type of functor from C, a presheaf from C to the category of sets, then in some sense I have to factor through this one. So in other words, this embedding already captures all the possible information that any other embedding, let's say, would capture. In other words,
you use the word embedding. I mean, what does word embedding here means? Embedding, like why don't you use like mapping?
Yes. So let's think about it in a certain way. So this space here is bigger. The thing on the left here is much bigger, right?
Mm-hmm.
When I say embedding, I could have mapped A, B, and C to any other sets,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's actually many, many sets here that could appropriately, that could serve as the target of this green map, okay? Mm-hmm. And embedding simply means that I've made some choice here. I've taken something in a smaller world and I've brought it up into a larger world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I can give another example, like from something we're familiar with, which is the power set, right? If we have a set A, B, C, right? The power set of A is like all combinations, right? So it would be A, B, C, A, B, right? All these examples here, right? C, CB, and so on, right? All the way up to ABC again. If I wanted to map the elements of A into PA, in some sense, the best or most natural mapping would be to just map my elements into their corresponding singletons. But notice how this is a much bigger space than this, right? So that's when I say embedding, that's what I mean. That you're taking something smaller like this and putting it into this bigger.
Now it makes more sense, I think.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So similarly here, the world of C-op to set, the world of presheaves is very vast. It's all, a presheaf is all possible mappings from C opposite to set. So one of these would be like the thing that maps all of these to a singleton, to a single, like one here. This is one possible presheaf, right? So like, this would be like a very, this would be a presheaf that loses all the information about all the differences between these objects and just maps them into a single set of one object or one element. So
can we conceptualize presheaves in terms of scales?
Presheaves in terms of scales. How so?
For example, this presheaf right here is on a bigger scale than where B, A, and C are.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I think that's a good example. So yeah, what the Yoneda lemma says is exactly this: that we are looking, when we look at HOM-B, so this term here, we are seeing B. We are seeing all the same information of B in a larger scale. What we are actually seeing what B is made of. And what B is made of is all the arrows that go into B. This is a set of, conceived as a set is just the set of morphisms, right? This is like, okay, so that's an abusive language because it's actually a functor, so it's not a set. But if we were to consider this evaluated on all the objects, what we would get is all the sets of arrows that go into B. And the Yoneda lemma is telling us that this set of arrows going into B tell us everything we need to know about B. So it's like looking at an image of B that is, in some sense, in a higher level or more information-rich space. And so when I said that that this summarizes the view of category theory. What I mean is actually not even the Yoneda lemma, but let's say a corollary of the Yoneda lemma, which is to say that for any map from A to B, we can find an equal map between functors.
Mhm.
Right, via the Yoneda embedding. So this is just to say that the objects in their essence are summarized. All the information is kept in this transformation, right? This is the Yoneda embedding. So Yoneda embedding, we could say, is a full and faithful functor. That's the takeaway here. Okay, and okay, but that's just kind of defining it and telling you like what it is. But actually, why is this useful? Why is this important? That's something that we really can't go into right now. Like in an actual mathematician's tool belt, why does switching from this view to this view, how does that solve actual problems? That's, you know, I would need to describe like an actual example of one. I think the Emily Real talk that's on YouTube, I can send it afterwards. It has a great example of using Yoneda lemma to actually describe matrices.
Can you put the link in the chat?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, but does that make sense? Like,
Yeah, I mean, in an abstract sense, this is just a definition or extension of the concept, but it is important to see why is this, I mean, what's the application of this?
mm-hmm. Yeah, what's an application of this? Okay, I think I had one prepared earlier having to do with, okay. So earlier I described this thing, right? When we want to talk about a space that's very complicated in topology, we often don't have information about this space, right? So the way that we compare this space to some other space is by maps onto the space. So I told you before that there is this notion of a map between a circle into a space, right? And we choose one particular base point, and this circle becomes mapped into a loop here, right? This is one map. And then we can do another map onto the space that goes, actually I should have chosen green as the color, right? So notice how this circle gets mapped to this loop here, and then another map takes, sorry, let me choose this color. Okay, so I've mapped this circle twice to this complicated space. And I'm saying that we can actually describe these two circles as being the same if one can be continuously deformed into the other one, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we said earlier that in a space like a sphere, if you were to map this, no matter how many circles you mapped onto this, they could all be deformed into a single point, right? So this one and this one and so on, they all go down to a single point because there's no obstacles, right? that tells us something about this space. Well, that's exactly the Yoneda perspective, because we're saying we don't know what this space is as such. What we know are maps into this space. So we know this map, and then every other map of possible circles into this space. And if you take all those maps together, we've summarized what the space is. We didn't need to know anything about the actual space itself. We just needed to know the maps in there and how they're different. So this is the homotopy perspective. So homotopy here means that all these maps are actually the same map. Can be considered to be the same map, because there's no obstacle that prevents them from being continuously deformed from one to the other.
So in the language of Yoneda dilemma, or the earlier, this is your smaller world, and this is the larger world, right?
No, and not exactly. In this, it's actually just two different objects in the topological space.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this would be just like A and B.
So if you are not, so which one is the word of functor and which one is the word of category? This is, both of them are different objects. But doesn't Yoneda dilemma deal with the word of functor and the word of category? So
yes.
That's a category, okay.
Yeah, this is category. So yeah, I only gave you the simple example of a circle into B, but actually there's many other spaces that we could use, right? So some other space that we kind of understand, that also can be mapped into here and also yield information, right? Mm-hmm. So this is the simplest one. Usually they do S1 and then they go up higher into higher dimensions. So like a sphere and so on. N-dimensional shapes can be mapped into B. B can be an infinitely dimensional, very complicated type of object. Mm-hmm. So you need higher dimensional objects or more complicated objects to characterize B. Mm-hmm. Right? So here's a space, here's a space. They all, each one of these maps is going to give you some information. Right? This is called the fundamental group, right? The fundamental group is characterized by this loop, and then how many different classes of maps. But there's also pi 1, pi 2, all the way to pi n, other groups of maps into B. So to fully know what B is, you cannot rest simply with the relations between A and B. You also need all the relations from this shape and B, and all the relations between this shape and B. And what is that? That is this. So the Yoneda embedding says that we can take B and just go here, and that's what B is. So this captures that exploration or that investigation of a space in terms of another category. Like this is another category. This resides in another category, I mean. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sorry, I missed that part. When you said we want to know what that took us here. What is B in the previous category?
B here is some complicated space.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. So B is a space that we don't understand fully, and okay. Instead of, let's say, working in its original category, mm-hmm. we are now working within the category of maps to B. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So in that case, B is this shape here.
Yes.
That everything gets mapped to it, and then we don't know what the shape is. Like it's a very weird, complicated shape, but we know all the maps.
Yeah.
So instead of understanding this within this category, we use Yoneda dilemma, which uses the information that these maps are giving us, and then brings
Reza,
us to
it's a
different...
lemma. It's not a dilemma.
Yeah. Well, for me, it's a dilemma,
for me,
right?
for you, it's
For
a
us, it's
dilemma.
a dilemma.
Yeah, for us it is.
Okay. I want to get some conceptual signposts for this. Obviously, I have to read up on those.
Yeah. It's not, again, it's unrealistic to think we can understand it on first glance, because I don't even understand it. So we're definitely just trying to get the faint shadow of what it is, just so we understand, okay, why did Badiou turn to this formalism? What does this formalism have to tell us about, like, why switch to diagrams if everything in diagrams can just be translated back to ontology anyway? What is the benefit of this diagrammatic approach? And I think the answer is here, even though Badiou doesn't really explicitly mention Yoneda lemma ever. But and maybe this goes back to our previous discussion, like why does he seem to have hesitation and so on? Well, I think there's a lot of work to be done to get to this perspective. And it's maybe not the directly important to Badiou as he was writing this book. But if we want to fully flesh out his theory of worlds, I think you would need to know this lemma and be able to work with it, because it is a certain perspective on objects. And he kind of gets to it when he talks about relations between objects. But
so is it fair to say that Badiou's world is not a simple categorical world? It's a world whose objects are functors. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, his world is a world of functors. Yeah, but they're not representable pre-sheaves.
They're not?
No.
Mm-hmm. And why is that?
Because they don't map to arrows of sets. Although, yeah, you could say that they are mapped from C opposite to set. So maybe they are pre-sheaves, but I don't think they're representable pre-sheaves. Because they're not isomorphic to this hum dash B. We'd have to establish that, at least. It has not been established that.
Actually, not that I fully understand it, but I would say that they are probably pre-sheaves. I mean, aren't objects these functors, like pre-sheaf functors?
Yeah, they're actually sheaves. So sheaves, we haven't gotten to yet, but sheaves are actually a specialization of pre-sheaves.
Mm-hmm.
There's a stronger condition.
Right. So
yeah.
hence pre-sheaf is the direction to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Once we know what pre-sheaves are, it makes it easier to do the next, the jump to sheaves.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so then
just to make a remark here, actually two remarks. One that it's actually funny, and the other is curious. The funny remark that I just sent you guys a book called on the chat window called Tool and Object, which is like a history of category theory, and I find it. I remember when I read part of it, it was very useful to understand the motivation behind it, and I think that I think what Dennis is trying to show with this kind of brief presentation of the Yoneda lemma. And this idea that you can preserve all information about a certain space only by looking at even further. I mean, if topology is already interested in transformations as ways to describe a structure, we get here an even further generalization of that idea to any sort of continuous function, right?
Sorry, say it again. Say it again. You distracted me with this book.
I mean, I think that the main insight that is interesting to us, which I think goes back to the idea of pointless topology, locale, things that we already saw, is that a big motivation behind category theory was a sort of generalization of a procedure that was known to the study of homologies in topology, which is to be able to describe, for example, a space simply based on transformations that are possible inside of it, and the comparison between transformations in a space and transformations in another space, which is something a bit of like what Dennis was showing. But if you define this in a general enough way, you don't need to be talking only about transformations in a space. You can be talking about transformations between any continuous function.
Yes.
So you generalize this idea beyond spaces to algebra itself, right? So you get to algebraic topology and things like this, and this idea of you can let go of, let's say, it's kind of also a sort of, it's like a big step in the same way that Galois was a big step with groups, right? Suddenly you're no longer interested in, the structures are not numbers, they are the structure of operators, right? There's a similar big step, because suddenly structure are not certain objects, but there are just the relations between them, and you can forget what was being related and nothing was lost in terms of information, right? This goes back to Badiou with the whole idea of we need a mathematics that is strong enough to have definite information about something, but not talk about what it is relating, right? We need a theory of relations and transformations and so on that is kind of indifferent to the things being related. So I think that the profound thing in what Dennis just showed with the Yoneda lemma is a similar sort of insight that you get with the idea of pure sets, right? It's kind of amazing to think that you have a concept that is empty of content, right, to that radical degree. And I think that it's a similar idea that how is it possible to have such a rich theory without any reference to the things being mapped, just the maps themselves, right? The idea that this would preserve that much information. And I think that Dennis' example with the transformations in closed loops like this, it's very telling of that, right? How is it possible that I can know everything about the thing being embedded simply by looking at what transformations are possible in the space?
So I hear you, and I like what you're saying and the direction
really
you're going with. But I want to read just a sentence from the introduction on page 301 that he says, it seems to say just the opposite of what you just said. He's saying that what is important ontologically or philosophically, or even probably, logically for us or for Badiou, is objects, not relations. And he says that relations don't have existence on their own.
Yes, but
and he says, you remember what I'm saying? He says,
it
suffices.
But relations in logics of worlds is relations in the common sense of how do lamps relate to the table. It's not relations in the sense that he used the whole book, which was always talking about mapping. Like objects are made of mappings. They're just restrictions on how things can be mapped to each other, like localizations and so on. So objects are already using the whole theory of relations from category theory. So what he calls relations in the chapter we are about to read is not where relationality comes into play in the book. Relations in the strong sense have been like at stake through the whole atomic logic. That's, let's say, the constitutive relation of a world. Because we don't have points, we only have mappings, right? We don't know what multiples map to, and we don't need to know. All we need to know is that objects
That's a very Deleuzian kind of interpretation. Looks like a very Deleuzian interpretation, right?
No, I think it's more like just maybe investigative or experimental, right? Because if you're in a space that you don't understand, how are you going to get information about that space, right? You can only do small exploration, small experiments to find out about it. But that in itself isn't really say anything that the space itself is like virtual or something like that.
And
it just
secondly,
means,
I mean, he makes two big claims that are not Deleuzian at all. First is that being is multiplicity and not this relational space of logics, right? So this comes on top of the multiple. This is not substituting his ontology. So he has a relational phenomenology, but not a relational ontology. And second, that he kind of rejects virtuality as due to materialism. So he already kind of took something from the Deleuzian field, but in his own terms. And when we get to the theory of relations, we are like very far off from, we used relations in a more strict categorical sense because there's all there is, right? Morphisms anyway. So relations are not morphisms. When we get to relations, there are a restricted type of function, right? And functions.
So let me get what you're saying. So you're saying that there is a sense of relation, which is a strict sense, which is this chapter we are going to review, and that's relation between objects. And his comment is that those objects allow relationality and everything that has to do with the relation, because those objects are exposed, predisposed to the kind of relation that we discuss. So that is.
Let me give you an example. Look, to use the classic philosophical example of something on top of a table, book on a table. Like if I have a book on a world, the phenomenon of the book is all possible transcendental indexings of that book. For example, if I look around it, I need the object is it's all the morphisms that I can get from every perspective of it, all the different shades, all the complex interrelations between its parts. There are relations that make the object. But when I ask the question of the book on the table, I have two objects that are already, let's say, logically more thinkable as a big bundle of morphisms or whatever. And then I'm asking about the relation between things made of these relations. So he distinguishes this, let's say, relations that appear. So why do you call the book a book and not a relation between its parts? But when you talk about the book and the table, you talk about the relation between the book and the table. Because some relations, they don't appear as relations, they appear as the object itself, and some relations appear as relations. And that second sense of relations that appear as relation, that's what this chapter deals with. It's a restricted, conservative sort of relation, which is not this interior, constitutive kind of morphisms that make the object itself.
Okay.
So that's very important.
Not in Badiou's terminology or Badiou's systematics, but more generally in mathematics, because I do sometimes it's sometimes hard for me to understand this. It's not that set theory is exhaustible in category theory or category theory is exhaustible to set theory, but they are different, right? That's the thing that I'm sometimes confused by. So we can say that, how to say this, you can explain what set theory, the consequences of set theory with category theory, but that doesn't mean set theory is exhaustible to category theory, right?
Yeah, so, I mean, that's a deep question. I think one thing for Badiou, though, we have to keep in mind that he's working with a specific subset of category theory, which is when he uses the dialectic, it's not the dialectic, the postulate of materialism, he's saying that every object can be reduced to a set, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but
So
I understand that Ej's question is different.
Oh, it's not that. Okay.
I thought his question was like, can you do everything that you do in set theory in category theory and vice versa?
That was what I was asking you. Like, can you
Is
do
it the
everything
short
what you
answer?
do in
No.
set theory
I
with
mean,
category theory?
set theory is a subset of category theory.
Yes, set theory is smaller, right? ZFC is
Much smaller word. Is a specialization of it's one category, one special category among infinite many different categories.
That's
Yes.
why after he wrote Being an Event, there were all these kinds of criticisms about why that fact that he was using set theory and not category theory, right?
Yeah, I think
That
that it's
makes more
good.
sense, right?
Yeah, it's just good to have like your question has a bit of. I'm not sure if that's what you mean, but I think that's good to have a kind of previous question, which is many people think he adopts ZFC because he's interested in the foundational role of set theory, as if ZFC, which is the argument is ontology is foundational. Set theory was supposed to be foundational, therefore set theory is ontology. And then when you show that there are broader things in set theory, haha, so that's a bad idea. But that was never his point. Like he was against the foundational position of set theory from the beginning. His concern is not with the place of set theory in the philosophy of mathematics, but on the actual expressive powers of ZFC. Like ZFC expresses things that are interesting in terms of people looking for certain properties in a system, and it abides to those properties. So even if set theory is forgotten by the history of mathematics, the only thing that matters is it expressible of certain properties which are relevant? And it is, and it will remain as such. I mean, of course, you might be able to express this in other places, and then the question is, okay, couldn't you say that ontology is a world? But you would agree. Like the fact that you can actually express the same things in a restricted topos, right? Something like this. Yes, so that's fine. But I think it's important also not to assume that it is important to find the most general formalism. Like ontology was never for Badiou the most general formalism. It's the correct one. Like it's not a matter of finding the most expressive thing. It's a matter of finding
And
the
actually,
thing that
the fact
expresses.
now I think it makes more sense. And the fact that category theory is more abstract makes it more useful for a theory of appearance.
Yes.
In
Okay,
a sense, set theory, as we've been talking a lot about this throughout some time now. In fact, set theory was chosen because it's poorer. It's less expressive.
Yeah. I mean,
Less
exactly. I think that's very important. Just so I don't forget while Dennis is drawing something. In this book I just sent you guys, Tool and Object, you find the following remark by MacLean, one of the founders of category theory. He says, the discovery of ideas in general as these, so as like algebraic topology, categories, is chiefly the willingness to make a brash or speculative abstraction, in this case supported by the pleasure of purloining words from the philosophers. Category from Aristotle and Kant, functor from Carnap, and natural transformation from the current informal parlance.
Wow.
So they stole it first.
Okay, now I feel good. Now I feel good that we have the power to lead category theory for it to serve the people.
Yeah, and you see, like we need to take it back from these guys. Yeah. But then there's a footnote saying, like, by the way, like what Carnap means by functor has absolutely nothing to do with what they mean, but like they like the word, like the word.
Now we should do a cultural revolution in which we will lead the masses to destroy the bourgeoisie in the party of category theory, right?
Exactly.
Actually, I was thinking the other day, the same way that set theory back then with Russell paradox basically made some limitations. The axiom of foundation made limitation to the power of language. Category theory, the same way suggests that language can cover more than set theory allows you to. In order for set theory to be consistent, it had to restrict the power of language. Category theory, so hence set theory was never aimed to replace language. Was something that was a different discipline of thinking than discipline of thinking that linguistics could could unleash. It was a different, more restrictive, hence consistent, hence more restrictive. But category theory is just the opposite. Category theory provides certain tools that is a superset of natural language and is much less restrictive than set theory.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good way of thinking about it, because I mean, when we went over this last time, I tried to show that, I mean, one way that I find intuitive to go about this is to see that in ontology, like the space of all possible subsets for a given set, right, is the space of everything that can be the answer to a yes or no question, right? Or to a question of, does it fall or not fall under this predicate? To whatever predicate, it will take you from the set to one of the subsets in that space. But if you were to relax your answer to any, let's say, to choosing not only elements leading to subsets, but parts of elements leading to part of subsets, or fuzzy subsets, or open subsets, right? So this loosening up, it's funny that language, kind of our intuitive concept of language, gets lost between the two, as you were saying. So in set theory, it's too restrictive, right? But category theory is much broader, like what it accepts as possible kind of codomains for a function is, it changes what functions mean, what codomains mean.
Yeah, when I was studying this and seeing that, okay, in order to think in the realm of ZFC, you have to forego some of the capabilities within the language. And there have been attempts, like by creating classes, concept of classes and stuff, to close the gap between what language can do and what set theory allows you to do. But I think category theory actually opens up this lead, and then unleashes the whole power of language. In this case, the natural languages becomes just a small subset of category theory, which, borrowing from Badiou's conceptions, is logic is a lot less restrictive than ontology, as he says over and over again.
Yeah, ontology is like a specific classical logic. He restricts the logic of worlds to certain axioms, and you get the ontological world, which is a classical world for him. Yeah,
And that's why he needs postulate of materialism, because if in logic there are a lot of different ways for things to appear, or things, there are a lot more possibilities. Not all those possibilities are real, i.e., they map back to the actual multiplicities. Yeah. That's why he needs a postulate of materialism, right?
Yeah. And it's a very interesting juncture, because as you were saying, of course, set theory is more restrictive than language. We would say so today, but you know, historically, there have been attempts to found, so to speak, language, not really natural language, but purify language in the logical sense, based on, you know, logical notions that are kind of isomorphic to, you know, set theory. I mean, naive set theory, things like that. I mean like Frege, this kind of thing, right? But you know, from the point of view of natural language, and from the point of view of the mathematics that we are studying now, of course, the Fregean framework is very, 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 very restrictive. And the idea was to be so in order to give some systematicity to the treatment of language, right? But from today's perspective, with the debunking of the logicist program, of course, category theory is much more promising in that sense, like something that can capture the logic of natural language in some sense, and to be even less restrictive than natural language itself, which is less restrictive than set theory, right?
Yeah, because this is exactly the conversation we had before about human versus inhuman predicates, or it's related to that, because of the type of predicates you can form in in category theory would be a larger class, right,
Mm-hmm.
than the ones in set theory.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least they would be enriched over some different kind of space, let's say. So you can actually convert ideas from set theory to the theory of toposes, which is what we're about to get to, right? So, for example, membership, we think of it as like something is in something else. But in the topos theory, this is relaxed, and instead of one thing being in something else, we just think of it as a morphism.
Mm-hmm.
So A belongs to B here. That just means there's a map from A to B here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or rather, let's say this is this
monomorphism.
Yeah. This is monomorphism. There's two types of relations, right? There's belonging and inclusion. So actually, this is flipped here, but just to get the idea that morphisms replace these membership and inclusion relations.
Cool.
Yeah.
And in free shifts, this is pretty common, right? To have like in the domain morphisms going from one morphism to another because they are natural transformations, right? And in the mirror image, you have relations of inclusion, for instance, if you are constructing topological spaces from what I'm reading about this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pretty common to define like the morphisms on one side as mapping relations of inclusion or of membership, something like that, in sets, right?
Yes, exactly. In sets, you have this type of thing as well, right? Yeah. For something that's a subset of another thing, you can also represent it as a function. But yeah, category theory just makes this more, more elementary. That this is the primitive form of expression, rather than a secondary thing that is built on top of membership. Membership is now expressed as a secondary thing. Okay, cool. And then, so actually, we're now getting to the limits, which I think are perhaps even more interesting than everything before. I don't know how far we can get to this, but so how should we go about this? Because it's kind of complicated. So
don't you? I mean, will it play into the relations stuff? Because I wonder if we shouldn't divide it between this and the next presentation. So we keep on going slowly with the mathematical stuff together with the stuff from the chapter. I just worry that
we
might never
go to relations first and then come back to this.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that we could, because there's still like 10 concepts from the mathematical interlude presentation. We're definitely not going to finish it today.
No.
I just wonder what's the threshold you think that's relevant for today, so that we can actually go to the book, and then next time we can do a bit more and then go to the book.
Yeah, it's a good point.
What are the concepts that are the main limits, and then what?
Limits, adjunctions, which we already covered kind of with, if you remember the adjoint, the left and right thing from post sets. So the adjunctions are just a more general version of that. Comma categories. So everything from comma categories to the end is talking about what a world actually is in category theory. This one could be.
Listen to that.
Yeah. We could skip to common categories. Also, I have another presentation, which is the relations. Maybe we should.
Yeah, I just wanted to get a bit into it just so we can actually, I think we should find a good balance between continuing with the mathematical discussion, but also advancing in the book. Otherwise, I think
I think that's good. But what time should we stop today, just in order to organize this for today, perhaps?
Yeah, I think we have 1 hour or so, right?
1 hour, something
a
like
bit
that.
more.
Well, it's up to Dennis if he thinks you want to start relations or go on. I don't know.
Yeah, I think we can start relations. Maybe that will actually give us more motivation for what the concepts are in the math interlude. Because
Actually,
I do.
I think we should finish math and go to relations, and I tell you why.
Okay.
Because when we get to relations, obviously the discussion will change. The discussion will go to Badiou's text, and we try to understand Badiou's text and stuff like that. If we flip back between mathematics and relations, I think it causes interruptions in the flow of, in our videos, and also in the flow of discussion. Like if somebody wants to listen to this and say, okay, I want to finish math, this is the presentation, these are the videos I watch, and then I go back to this video for relation. So I think it would be much better to finish mathematics, and then for people who don't want to watch these mathematics videos, they don't have to just flip forward part of this video and then go to the next video and continue and things like that.
Well, I can do something easier, which is just to stop the recording and start it anew and upload this separately. I just worry, like, honestly, I mean, it's totally a personal view. I'm absolutely interested in the mathematical stuff, but I have the impression that there is so much and there are such big gaps, in different gaps in our knowledge of this stuff, that to actually go through these 10 last slides and at the same time have all these high discussions, we're gonna need like 2 or 3 meetings. And I like to move with the reading, and I think that I'm all up for doing this either in parallel or dividing or so on. But it would seem to me like it's a bit like to have 5 meetings on the mathematical interlude before we start relations. We're going to get to the end of the book by like mid next year. And I'm not sure if we're going to have them next year in Brazil, so I'm a bit anxious.
Yeah, I'm okay with that then. Yeah.
Maybe you could something in the
That
middle.
was a very glib outlook.
Oh man, if you knew, if you only knew.
Yeah,
Well, I'm not sure if you have next year in US either.
Exactly.
So all you guys should come to Canada.
Yeah, perhaps I'm not sure. There are some options here. Perhaps we could alternate, as Gabriel is saying, or finish math, or even if Dennis thinks so, maybe to select something of this math presentation in order to finish it maybe today and start relations next time. But then I think it would have to selection must be made, because I don't think we could cover it today. Everything.
So this is what I suggest. Let's finish the math today. No matter where we get, we start a relation, and no coming back to math.
So Dennis, you have to select the.
Yeah, Dennis, you. This is your presentation. You make the final decision.
Yeah, I'm okay with, yes. Let's just finish the math then now. But
dude, you can always pretend like you finished it, and then in the middle of the relations presentation phase.
Yeah, I'm just gonna cheat and go back. I mean.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I just yeah.
The thing is, like, there's no way, like Gabriel was saying, there's no way we're gonna get a good grasp of these next few slides in the time we have left. So best things we can hope for is get a very high level view. If you guys are okay with that.
Yeah, I think that's enough, man. Like,
yeah, I'm okay too.
Yeah.
I think it's what we can do, really.
Yeah.
I forgot to say, Iji, have you seen the Craig address by Badiou?
I haven't seen it, no.
Yeah, it's important for your question earlier. We'll post this to the chat. Sorry.
Okay. So yeah, let's try to make it through this. This is the probably the most challenging part of the whole thing anyway. Okay, so limits. Very similar to the talks about posets earlier, but more in a categorical flavor. So we can forget all this stuff here because it will take too long, but basically it's exactly what Badiou describes in Mathematics of the Transcendental, which is that for a given portion, let's say, of a category, which is described by this little plane here, we can define two privileged objects, one being the object that every object in the diagram, which is this plane, the one object that every object here sees, and another object that sees everything in the plane. Right? There's two, let's say, cones here, right? And technically, the bottom one is called a cone, and the top one is called a cocone. Right? They're duals, exactly in the sense that we've been saying that every category you can flip the arrows and get kind of a mirror image, and the same for all the statements of one. You can get it in the other. So why is this important? Because these privileged objects, they encapsulate a property in category theory. So before we said in set theory, we have it kind of easy because properties are simply expressed in, let's say, first order logical terms, right? If we want, or let's say, if we want, like, let's say the product of two sets, that's kind of given to us by the primitive notion of product that's already given in sets, right? Actually, I think it's one of the axioms that give us that. But in category theory, we don't have such axioms. We don't have such primitive notions of product and so on. So we have to invent them. And the way we invent them is by, in terms of what's called a uniqueness condition of a universal limit. Okay, what this means is, this actually goes into discussion earlier about factorizing maps. So one quick diagram. Remember before that I said any map, any morphism between two objects can actually be factored into two other morphisms, right? The same way we can compose, we can also decompose, right? And this factorization tells us that in order to get this map, we needed to take two steps instead of one, right? So whatever, like G and H here. So and that means that this object here shares a special relationship with this map here. It's kind of like a gatekeeper, let's say, that says you cannot pass through F without first passing through G and then H, right? Or, you know, that's another way of saying these two are commutative. They result in the same thing. So why is factorization important here? Because when we have a unique set of cones, when we have a set of cones that match a certain condition, uniqueness means that one of these cones is a factor of all the other ones. Okay, a bit like prime numbers, right? So you know that like any number can be decomposed into primes, but primes cannot be decomposed any further, right? Primes are, their only divisors are themselves and one, right? In that same way, these objects are kind of like the, well, that's the term, limit of a certain process of decomposition. So given all, so what do these red arrows mean? This means like, given any cone that has this sort of relationship to the three circles here, there's going to be one cone that is the limit of all the other ones. It is the, let's say, the smallest factor, right? The undecomposable factor of them. And so all the other ones have a unique relationship to it. Okay, so
limit is a cone, but a limit is a cone that cannot be factored any further.
exactly. It's only factors itself. It factors itself, and that's it. Yeah, it participates in its own universality in a sense. But all the other ones only participate in its universality in this using these factor arrows, right? Remember that every object has an identity map. So you can imagine that this last one, this red thing here, has its own map to itself that's also unique. So it belongs to the set of things that factor through it. Okay, but it just happens to be the limit of them. So okay, what is an example of this? So in the category of sets, it would be the classic example would be given an A and a B, the limit of this diagram would be A times B. And it looks like this. So you can think of like other objects having, these are other cones, right? We can think of an infinite number of objects that have morphisms to A and B. But why is A times B special? Because in some sense, all of these maps, they have A times B as a factor. Right, and so that means it's actually something like this, right? They bypass each other. They don't necessarily go through each other here, but okay. So A times B is kind of like a common factor. In other words, to use this thing on the left here, if I have something to B, I have to factor through A times B here, right? You see exactly this structure I showed above. You just need to show both, right? Both sides here. Right, exactly the same idea of factoring an arrow. Okay. And from this, this is how we define unique objects and arrows inside of a category. And just to kind of make it a bit simpler for us to grasp, when we talked about post sets earlier, we talked about the idea of meets and joins, right? So this is the join, and this is the meet. Well, in category theory, this is exactly a limit and a co-limit, right? So this is the limit. This is the co-limit. And in some sense, categories are just post sets with some extra conditions, right? Yeah, I mean, they're very similar in a lot of ways. So if you need an intuition for what limits and co-limits are, you can think of them as exactly joins and meets of a certain type.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, but that doesn't exhaust this more general phenomenon called the universal mapping property. Limits are only one type of this, limits and co-limits. There's also just other things using adjunctions and other methods. We can find the same kind of universality in other ways, right? By universality, we mean arrows that are unique in some sense. Like in all of the categories and all the objects and all the arrows, this specific object and this specific arrow is can be different from all the others, and it's the only one that fulfills that rule. That's what a universal mapping property is intuitively. Okay. And then this is just another kind of description of that, again, using this triangle of decomposition, exactly like we had here, just a little more involved because it uses functors as well. Yeah.
So
This.
the arrows, I remember from mathematics of transcendence, the arrows from cones to limits are unique. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So maybe I should have drawn it in a different color here, but yeah, these arrows here are all unique arrows. Yeah. So and we can say that these cones factor uniquely through this cone.
Mm-hmm.
And this cone itself factors uniquely through itself, right?
Mm-hmm. And the importance of uniqueness is that it cannot be factored any further.
Yeah, because our category is full of arrows, and we want to be able to find special properties that are not held by anything else.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we want to construct new objects that have certain properties that are not found in the other objects.
Mm-hmm.
And we can do that by saying that they obey some universal condition. So that all the other objects, when they go through that object, they see that there's some property that must follow if they are to interact with that object.
It seems to me that like these are actually two very, very kind of essential insights of category theory, that commutation, can you say that?
Commutative.
Commutativity and uniqueness, they are like two relational resources to determine something, right?
Yeah.
To find a unique arrow, or to guarantee that two arrows, they compose, like taking, like one arrow is the composition of other two arrows. Those are like two basic ways of investigating a diagram, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or a structure. It's really
And they're
profound.
opposite. They're opposite to each other.
They're opposite, but they're complementary, right?
They're complementary.
I from everything we've seen thus far, this for me, like if I had to tell anyone the basic like intellectual insight of all of this, I think those are the things I would focus on. Like the fact that two actions can be substituted by one means that you've learned something. Like you've captured something about it, right? That something
you can define two in terms of the one, or vice versa.
Yeah, the fact that you have proven that you can substitute two things for one, two actions for one action, means you've understood something about that action, right? And similarly, to find what it means for a certain transformation to be unique from this to that, meaning that other things can be like, it's the closest version of that, right?
Yeah, it's the closest version of that. Yeah.
Those two, they seem to be like very important kind of touch stones for knowing if you made something intelligible, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's very different from like extensional intelligibility, right?
Mm-hmm.
To prove what is inside of something. It's a totally different way of thinking, really.
Yeah, exactly. I think one example is actually the example I've been talking about here is if you use just numbers, right? If we had like the number 2 and the number 3 here, we could say that in some sense the number 6 is the limit because it's 2 times 3, right? Because if arrows here mean like is divisible by, let's say another number that's divisible by both 2 and 3,
like 12,
would be 12, right? And then 18 and 24, right? Well, notice how all of these are also divisible by 6, right? Yeah. So, and 6 is divisible by itself. So in that sense, 6 is the undecomposable limit, right? There's nothing else smaller than 6 that could have this property. Yeah. So this is a simple way, like, but this is different from how we normally think. Okay, find the smallest, sorry, the least common multiple. Sorry, that's what it's called, right? The least common multiple. That's a property.
We start to forget the elementary math.
Yeah. Yeah. So everything in category theory is like that, right? You have some property, you want to somehow filter or sift through this giant space for this one particular object that fits that property. How do you do that? You have to create these cones, or there's other methods, but this is like one way, is to create these cones and say all these cones will converge or have a limit to this object.
And
that,
the arrows from 6 to 3 and 2, those are what's called projections. Right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. And these all have projections, right?
Yes, I actually found the quote that you put from Ellerman really helpful. I took a screenshot of it. I was reading it. I think it's really helpful, that quote.
Yes, exactly. This text, I'm still trying to understand it, but I thought this quote was really useful. So he says here, Russell's paradox drove set theory out of Frege's paradise. As set theory was reconstructed to escape the paradoxes, the set universal for a property was always non-self-participating.
Yeah, so that means that it cannot belong to itself.
Yeah,
And
no
that actually relates to Badiou, and it's really good.
Yeah. Thus, set theory became not the theory of universals, but the theory of non-self-participating universals. But the reformulation of set theory cleared the ground for a separate theory of always self-participating universals. And this idea was realized in category theory by universal mapping properties. And then, yeah, the self-participating universal for a property is the paradigmatic or archetypical example of the property. All instances of the property are determined to have the property by a morphism participating in that paradigmatic instance, where the universal participates in itself by the identity morphism.
So every limit is also, let's say, its own limit, right?
Yeah. Yeah, here the property is divisible by 2 and 3. So I have a category of numbers, and I say, give me everything that's divisible by 2 and 3. Well, this theory tells us that of that set, there's going to be one special object that all the other ones are divisible by, and also divisible by itself, right? Because of the identity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's this property taken to a limit. So this is like universal, right?
But in general, this the ID property does not exist in set theory. Like, given any object, there is an ID arrow to that object. So is it fair? I mean, in set theory, a set cannot see itself, whereas in category theory, there is always an arrow to the same object. I never saw that as what this quote says, but I think the ID arrow is way more. I mean, he interprets it in the context of the universal property, but he uses ID arrow. But ID arrow is one of the primitives in category theory. No.
Yeah, it's a primitive, but I mean, it's all. You can also do an ID arrow in functions as well, an identity function, right? It's just, if you have a set of 3 things, it's just the thing that takes it to itself, right? So if your set is like ABC here, you just, this is the identity.
No,
so
but this is not the same set seeing itself. This is another set, which is A times A, not A that sees itself, whereas the object sees itself.
Yeah, in some sense, the object in some sense is nothing but its own identity.
Yeah, but I think that it's a confusion there, because it's not self-belonging, because self-belonging is already talking about it. in a grammar where things are extension. But when you only have the arrows, to say that it goes from A to A is not to go, there's no two things to go between. So it arrives at this sort of self-reflexive thing by changing the grammar, not by kind of allowing for some contortion. So there is no A and to have two of it. If it goes from itself to itself, then it's the same thing as two different sets. Like, I think that distinction is kind of neutralized.
Yeah, definitely. I think the extensional thing is what makes it, what kind of blocks set theory from expressing this.
Yeah, okay, I didn't get that, but let's continue.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, and there's a close relationship between limits and adjunctions, which we don't need to go further into it. This is like, adjunctions are the most important concept. So I said earlier, Yoneda lemma is important, but it's only because it gives you a kind of a philosophical viewpoint of category theory, and of course it's useful, but adjunctions are, let's say, the unique concept that you won't find anywhere else besides category theory. And Galois, of course, somehow came up with it in a certain sense. But adjunctions in the larger senses are very important because they, exactly what we said before, that given a certain map, it determines another map in this unique, like, coupled way. But then this needs to be lifted into the context of functors between categories. Okay. And then there's these special maps we call the unit and the co-unit, which are natural transformations that obey these rules here. And then this formula down here kind of looks like the adjunction conditions we talked about before, right? Remember, with if you just imagine like f of c is less than or equal to d, if and only if c is less than or equal to g of d. That's exactly the monotonic adjunction we talked about before. Now we're expressing it in a slightly different way, but the idea is still the same. You're still trying to uniquely specify a map, right? I think just one nice example of this adjunction that I think is interesting is the notion of a closure. So this is actually has to do with the example that Gabriel asked at some point, between if you have like animals, right, and gene pools. If you imagine these are two different categories, we can define an adjunction by taking a set of animals here. Let's call it a set of animals. This is one functor, let's say. So there's many different sets of animals here, right? Let's just assume there's just one here. It sends it to another set of animals here. And then the closure operator is another function which sends it not to the original set of animals, but to the set of animals possible from mating. Okay, and you see how this doesn't necessarily come back as an isomorphism. It could be if your set of animals cannot be mated, then this would just be an kind of an isomorphic or inverted thing. But in some cases, you have a set of animals that produce more animals by, yeah, or let's say like flowers or whatever, like cross pollination. You can cross two species together, right, to create another set here. This is called closure, right? In some sense, closure means you've taken all possible combinations of this thing, and that's produced something more than what you started. And this would be called the unit of a junction. Just to give you some flavor of what the unit and the co-unit give us, right? Co-unit would appear over here on the right side if it were flipped around. Yeah, and that's what this expresses, right? That oftentimes we have two categories. We have some functor that takes one to the other, and then we can define a new special adjunction that has some logical relationship to the map we defined. Here it's the closure operator on the set of animals by mating. Okay. Yeah, and then this example here, it's saying that the so what Badu defined earlier as the implication operation, he said it was this, right? The degree that A implicates Y, you know, in the logic, right? The greater logic. The degree of that A implicates Y or determines Y is defined by Y conjunction of not A. And then we also have A conjunction X. And there's actually an adjunction between these two. F of X and G of Y are adjoined. So there's some relationship between conjunction and implication. We can define one from the other. Similarly, there's a adjunction between exponentials. So y to the x power in category theory means all maps from x to y. It's exactly the thing we said x to y is equal to hom I think yx, right? All maps from, remember hom takes an object to to the maps between them. So if you fix both of these, then this is a set of maps. And then there's x by y, which we define by the limit, right? This thing here, right? This construction here. We say that there's some adjunction between these two things. Okay. Okay. Finally, we can skip common categories. Slash categories are important. So we can form a new category if we take from the original category. You take objects and we take maps to a fixed object. Then we form a category where maps, so objects themselves would be these pi1 maps and pi2. Those are objects, and then the morphisms between them would respect commutativity. So it makes this like triangle diagram. So to give you kind of a better idea of that, so we have in a regular category like objects relating to each other in all these different ways, right? And so on, right? If I were to suddenly pick one of these to be a special kind of privileged object, I can convert this category into the category over, and let's call this one T. The category over T, which is every object is the collection of maps between the original object in C and this T object. So in some sense, this T becomes the central thing, right? So this is one object, and then this is another object, and this is another object, right? Notice that all these objects, they're kind of focused or directed towards this central object. And now we say that because it's a category, right, we can have morphisms between objects. In this case, there would be morphisms that obey composition of arrows. I don't know if that made sense. Right? This is called a slice category. And this is exactly what, in some sense, a world is, right? In Badiou's scheme, this red thing is the transcendental. And individual objects are indexed, sorry, let's use his terminology, right? These are objects, right, in the world. So a relation, what he calls a relation between objects is just an arrow between these two things that respects the following rule, right? If this is F and G and H, then F must equal H follow G, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is when we talk about like later on relations conserving existence and so on, that is summarized by this thing.
Okay, now it makes more sense to me.
Yeah, this is a slice category.
Yeah, I mean, and it's good just to understand that, to go back to Reza's question, like objects themselves are defined by this F and H, right? It's just that these things he doesn't call relations, he calls transcendental indexing. And he only call relations the G's.
Exactly, yeah.
So in the formalism, the distinction is not necessarily, it's not qualitative. Everything is morphisms or relations and so on. But philosophically, he's making the distinction between this intra-objectal or constitutive relations, which are the indexing, right? And the, let's say, extrinsic relations, which are relations between objects.
It sort of names some of these G's, like localization and things like that.
I think localization is inside the object, between components of the object, right?
No, I mean, you can localize an object on another object, right?
I think you localize atoms on degrees, right?
Yeah.
Or atoms on atoms, maybe.
Yeah, I think localization is atomic, right? In the sense that even if you do localize an object on another, it's a weaker because it needs to preserve the atomic localization of the object, right? Of the parts of the object with itself. So these are weaker because they cannot, let's say, transform the things that they are relating. They will remain minimally what they are, right? How they exist, at least.
Yeah, atoms exist in this region here, right? Right, atoms are over here.
Yeah, that's how I understand it.
Yeah, some imminent further decomposition of this arrow to T. But over here, G is conditioned by what the atoms have as information, but G itself kind of, in Badiou's exposition, G is like a passive type of thing, a carrier of information for what's happening here. Yeah. Okay, so that's what this
Good
construction is. Okay, so 2 more or 3 more points here. Bundles. Okay, bundles are important because they give us a notion, an easier version of sheaves. That's one reason. And then it also kind of gives us a nice notion of space, which is more independent of topological spaces in general, right? Remember before that we said topological spaces obey like this kind of lattice structure, right? Topology has it's a set equipped with some like inclusion relationship that looks like a lattice, right? And it must have the empty set, and it's closed under certain rules and so on. Well, bundles are kind of a generalized, they give us a generalized notion of space. So imagine you have some, and I think maybe we already talked about this, but imagine you have a space here and you map it onto some other space here, right? Well, a bundle basically gives us all of the possible slices of this F. So F here maps everything in this larger space, let's say, into a smaller space, but we can take local patches. Let's say I just want to pick out this patch here and see what gets mapped here in this space. This is F inverse restricted to U, right? If we call this red stuff U here, right? So in some sense, if we kind of generalize this idea that we can take small patches of our target space and kind of see where the inverse takes us in the original space, the domain, we actually start to see this picture forming, which is different let's say snapshots of this space here. I think the easier way of thinking about this is actually using sets. So if we have a bunch of set of points here, and let's say we have 2 points over here in the codomain. If I map these points, obviously because the codomain has less points, I'm gonna have, it won't be an injective function, right? I'll have to double up, let's say, right? Like so. Well, a bundle is just this picture kind of inverted in a way, seen from the perspective of the codomain. So it looks like this. Right, so the one over here, let's say A and B, right? A and B. And we said that there's four things mapping to A. So this is called a stalk. It has 4 things on it, and then this one has 3 things on it. Right? Well, in some sense, this stalk actually describes several different copies of our codomain in some more generalized space. So I can do this operation of lifting, where I lift this space, this circle here, and I select these 2. So why do I select these 2? Because if I select these 2, I have exactly a copy of the bottom, right? I have a copy of, because the bottom is only defined by 2 points. So if I select 2 points, 1 from each stalk, I've created a copy of my original space, right? And I can make multiple of these copies, right? I can make this one, I can make this one, or I can select these 2, or I can select these two, or I can, select these two. So in some sense, this space is much richer than the one below. It's like this space has been embedded into a larger space. Right, we call this the bundle space.
This is really interesting.
Yeah, bundle space. And originally it's called etal space. They're the same thing. Right? And this is interesting, yeah, because this space here was never defined by topology. I mean, yeah, we can find an equivalent topology to suit this, but we just defined it simply by looking at all the possible copies of our codomain up here. So it's kind of like generating a space from a morphism. Okay. And if we look at the previous, so that's kind of what this thing shows us, right? E of X here, there's a stalk, and the points is a set of points that map to that thing on the bottom. So you see some of them have like multiple things on per stalk, meaning there's like 2 points that map to the same point at the bottom. And then again, we can do this lifting procedures where this bottom circle suddenly has several degrees of freedom, right? And this is a big thing in physics, right? Right, because physics is all about trying to track some information over some complicated space. That information will tell us like how particles can behave given certain conditions and so on. Well, by doing this kind of procedure, we can lift the space up to see this more complicated, let's say, higher dimensional space. This top thing is actually where like physical theories can happen, right?
Amazing.
Yeah. And again, we can relate these two things, right? Because in the slice category, everything is above a T. So in that sense, T in this slice category is just like the base space. It's like this circle thing at the bottom. C1 and C2 are like different pink lines. And so we can lift T up into this more generalized space defined by the pi1 and pi2 functions. So yeah, that takes some imagination, but just try to translate this triangular, this commutative diagram to thinking about multiple copies of this picture here.
So just so I understand, bundles can be formulated as slice categories.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the category of bundles is the same as a slice category. So given a space, let's say it's this thing. I have some other stuff here, and I have a map, right, that takes it here. Well, I have another space here that also has maps to go here. So these are both bundles, right? We call this B1, B2. And then this is a relation between B1 and B2. And this triangle is exactly this thing here.
We're at the level of abstraction so high. I think I need some coffee.
It's not very intuitive. It's hard to make it stick, We would need a lot of hours and examples too, which I don't have on me. But I think if you read Goldblatt, where Badiou gets a lot of his
most of this stuff is.
Yeah, this is it all revolves around slice categories and bundles to motivate the notion of toposes. Okay, so we are now at this is actually the last slide we need. The one afterwards is just like historical note. So we found out what a bundle is. The only thing we need to now, the only perspective shift we need now is to consider that we can now inhabit the base space in a way. So remember that this this bundle picture here, right, is a slice category and so on. Well, if we imagine that we are a person sitting here, the question is, what do these bundles look like from our perspective? Well, that's the same as asking, given, let me draw it maybe a bit bigger here. We're right here. We have all this stuff going on above us, right? This crazy bundle, B1, B2. There's a bunch of information here, and they are coming down here to our local region. This is our field of view. We can only see this much. We don't see the whole space because the space is too complicated, right? So a sheaf just says that this has to be consistent no matter where I travel. So I'm here and I see a consistent space. That means that the portion of the bundle that is defined by this area is the same as the portion of the bundle defined by this area, right? And if I were to, let's say, walk over here, now I'm over here, the same thing happens, that this, let's maybe use a different color, right? Now I'm over here and the bundle agrees here as well. And in fact, no matter where I walk, these two things are going to agree. Not only that, if I walk in a circle, I walk all the way back to where I started, I'm gonna get back to where I'm gonna see exactly the same thing that I started with. So it's just to move from bundle to sheaf. It's just a perspective thing. It's a change of the information is the exact same.
What is consistent? Consistent. What is consistent is the area within which you are, or the things that you see above you, or both.
Yeah. The what you see above you, which is yeah, what you see above you. Let's say.
Okay.
Yeah, because remember that bundles are this more complicated space that sits above your space, right? So as you walk around, to say it's consistent means that if you look at bundle 1 and you look at bundle 2, you see the exact same thing. It's like the clouds, let's say. You see the same thing in both of them. And that's what this diagram shows, right? It basically says that if I give a subset of my topological space at the bottom, and I have another subset, I can see that the dotted lines tell you what you see, right? Some information here, some information here, and then if I walk into their intersection, right, the space which is common to both subsets, I see their intersection of the data. Similarly, if I were to like walk the entire length of this highlighted area here, I would see their union, right? If I were to just like a scientist record everything that I'm seeing, I would eventually conclude that it's exactly the same. It's just the union of those two.
So how is sheaves how is a sheaf a pre-sheaf?
It's a pre-sheaf plus another set of properties, right?
No, I
More
understand, but conceptually, I mean.
Yeah. So yeah, so you have to think of pre-sheaves as being kind of a disordered bundle in a way, like two bundles that don't agree
Mm-hmm.
everywhere. And because they don't agree, you can't glue them together. So yeah, I said before, like, imagine you walked in a circle in this space. The entire time that you walked in the circle, let's say you made two circles, you saw the same thing both times. You didn't see any difference in the bundles above you. But a pre-sheaf would be one where, let's say you walked once and you were looking up the whole time, right? The second time you made a circle, you saw something different, right? It doesn't match. And maybe the third time you walked, you also saw something different again. And then maybe the fourth time, you finally see your original space again, or so on, right? But it doesn't obey a consistency such that you can locate where you are by looking at the bundles. Whereas in a sheaf, you can locate exactly where you are in the bottom space by looking at the information at the top space.
Mm-hmm.
So navigationally, it's different, right?
Yeah, navigationally, you can find where you are in a sheaf
By looking above.
by looking above, but you
Okay.
cannot necessarily do that in a pre-sheaf.
Okay.
And that's what the uniqueness and the gluing property. There's like their coherence. They define the coherence of your space in a way by looking at the data. I mean, the original conception also by William Lauvier, who came up with elementary toposes, not the notion of sheaves, but of topos. He thought of it as a variable set. So if you think about it, his viewpoint's also very enlightening. Imagine you're in some space and you have a set S. So you're this guy, and you see in front of, or see above you, a set S. As you walk, now you're over here, you see another set S, S1, S2, right? And then you walk over here, you see another set, S3. Well, in that sense, this can be thought of as separate sets, but it can also be thought as one set changing spatially, a variable set, a set whose elements vary continuously as you move in this space. So that's what I mean by you can make a circle. When you come back, you'll just see S1 again.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with sheaves, it's not a variable set.
No, this is sheaf.
These are the sheaves. Yeah.
Okay,
These are the sheaves.
Okay.
It's consistent. Yeah. So you can go back and see what you started with.
From what I understand, in the pre-sheaf, you can affirm the inclusion of some surface within another, but you don't have the uniqueness and the gluing condition in order to reconstruct the whole of which they are a part, right? I think this is maybe a kind of a conceptual difference between the pre-sheafs and the sheaves. You can affirm inclusion with the pre-sheaf without constructing the borders between the surfaces, right? It's something like that, isn't it? Or am I wrong?
Yeah, exactly. That with a pre-sheaf, if I were to erase the space down here, you can maybe see it clear. With a pre-sheaf, I cannot tell where I am just by looking at the above set. Right? I mean, again, this is using the navigational metaphor, but like a pre-sheaf might tell me S1 here, and might also tell me S1 over here.
Okay. Now,
So like
now I get it.
I moved some distance, but I still see the same set. Or I make a loop. I come back to where I was, but now I see
Different
S2.
set.
Yeah, different set. It's not consistent. So I can't just rely on the set to navigate. Yeah, but another way to say it is, yeah, a presheaf, because in a lot of ways, a presheaf is just a collection of like covers on some space. So this is a space. This is an alternate way, right? The intersections here don't necessarily like this is, if this is set A, this is way too complicated actually, but if this is set A, this is set B, then this intersection is not necessarily true, right?
Like with a presheaf, you can affirm the inclusion of A and B, but not the composition with the intersection of A and B, right?
Yeah,
Something like that. Like if you're walking, you can get to see S1, S2, or S3 with a presheaf, but you don't get the correlation of a specific point with S1, S2, S3, which is the condition of the sheaf, right?
exactly.
Now, what is it that you call the sheaf? You call these looking up. This is the sheaf? These mappings are the sheaf?
Yeah, the mapping is the total combination of the S's with the space below.
Okay. So sheaf is the relation of two categories.
Yeah, exactly. It's a relation of C op. In this case, C op to set, but it doesn't have to be set. In categories, it's C op to set like this.
Mm-hmm.
That's also a pre-sheaf, right? But it's this with special conditions.
Yeah, if you put in the additional conditions, you get to the sheaf. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in a sense, this is C op, this is set, right?
Mm-hmm.
And remember that this is opposite of the bundle, right? So bundle, we call it like the base space here. So in some sense, they're kind of the opposite viewpoint. One starts from the cloud, which is the B, and looks at the base. And the other one is as if you're an inhabitant of the base and you look at the clouds, which are sets.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So what are the other two slides?
Toposes. So some historical notation. Let's see. So Grothendieck, his invention is to figure out how to add a topology to categories. So again, if we look at this thing, right, we said a topology, it has this lattice-like structure. But categories don't seem to have a lattice-like structure, right? They're more like a graph, right? Like this. So Grothendieck discovered or intuited that actually we can make this into a topology if we simply filter out the arrows in such a way that we treat one of these objects as if it were the topmost object. So he said, oh, what if we were to treat this object as this thing? And then this object is this one, this object is this one, right? And then notice there's some like loop here. We treat this one here, but we just eliminate this arrow. We don't count it, right? So in that sense, we turned this category, we gave this category a topology.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
By eliminating some information.
Yeah. By eliminating some information, yeah. This is called a sieve. right? And this is one way to think of it, at least. A sieve is a functor from one category to this other category that looks like a topology. And the pair of a category and a sieve is called a site, which is different from what Badiou calls a site, I think.
Mhm.
There might be some relation that we don't know yet. So Grothendieck discovered that we can topologize categories. And then once we topologize them, we can do exactly this picture. We can start to treat categories as if they were topological spaces. So we can treat a category like this purple thing here, and we can extend that metaphor of a person walking around, right? Now you're walking around, but instead of walking around in a space, you're walking around in a category.
Okay, now I get why Zalamea uses Pierce with Grothendieck. Okay, I think. Because the navigational metaphor makes sense with Grothendieck toposes, right? Okay.
Yeah. He makes the navigation metaphor make sense in categories, not only spaces. Because he starts to treat categories like spaces. And then historically speaking, like William Lauvier and Miles Turney, they create a simplification of Grothendieck's construction. They call it elementary topos. And this is what we have been talking about as the thing with the central object, the subobject classifier, right? This is the more logical way of right? They show that this thing is equivalent to Grothendieck's thing. And basically what it says is every subset of B, so A is a subset of B here, can be characterized by this commutative diagram where this omega thing is called the subobject classifier. And it basically tells us, so for Boolean logic, this is only 0 run, right? Or you say false and true. And this A is a limit, exactly like we said before. It's a limit of this diagram, B and 1. So we have a way to do set theory using this object here, which is equivalent to, well, it makes sense too, like just like this navigation metaphor allows us to conceive of sets in a consistent way. I forget where the picture I drew was. Oh, this one. In some sense, this is a suitable place. This is telling us that sheaves are a suitable place to do set theory because they're consistent. Because I can walk around in this space and always get back to the set I started with. It's consistent enough to do set theory.
And it's even more powerful because these sets can be open.
Exactly. These sets
like,
are
they're
open.
not like closed extension.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we can also conceive of Badiou's atoms as being located in some sense here, I think, in somewhere in this sheaf space, right? Like when we say two atoms are consistent, or sorry, what does he say? Where the localization of one on the other is equal to their existence.
Compatible.
Compatible, yeah. We can translate that compatibility condition that Badiou has into this navigational metaphor again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, how does it map to that square that you drew? How does this navigation map to the square that you drew?
Yeah, I don't know exactly like the details, but I think you could say that the transcendental is down here, right? And then, what you mean the square in the
Yeah,
here?
this one. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is the transcendental, right?
Yeah, it is consistent with Badiou because
No, I get that. I get that the omega is transcendental, but how does it, this one maps to the navigation metaphor? That's what I was.
Okay. Yeah. So so in some sense, a subset of B is just the sets you can see from inside B. If B is, so before in set theory, you have this kind of spatialization where B is a set, you see everything in B at once. But imagine if B is so big, you can only ever see a chunk of it. That's A. Right? And now I know A is a subset of B. I walk over here. Now I found another set, A dash, and so on, right? That's kind of what this is saying, because we're saying that A satisfies some condition of consistency with the sub-object classifier.
I see. So if I understand correctly, then this is the sheaf.
Yeah, I don't know. Each A and B are both sheaves.
Oh, but aren't they objects?
Exactly. It's the category of sheaves, so sheaves are the objects.
Right, right.
Mm-hmm.
So then this becomes a functor.
Yeah, they're functors, but you can abstract away the functors and just think of them as morphisms.
So in Badiou's language, then this is an object, and this is an atom of that object?
No, this would be a sub-object of that object. But so Badiou doesn't necessarily talk about sub-objects. I was just saying that elementary. So there's a question of whether Badiou is familiar with or cares about elementary toposes. We know
that was what I was going to ask. But you use Grothendieck topos.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Badiou uses Grothendieck toposes. That's they're equivalent in some sense, but one is a logical and simplified version, or more general version.
I see. Grothendieck topos is not that picture.
No.
No, Grothendieck topos is not this.
This is Lovere
yeah,
elementary.
Yeah, but there's a way that we can generalize a G topos to a Lovere topos. So, like, the line is kind of blurry, right?
Because Badiou talks about this. Badiou talks about this in mathematics of transcendence.
Yeah, and he talks about the Grothendieck toposes as well in logics.
He does? Okay.
Yeah, he defines the world as a Grothendieck.
This was magnificent. I'm glad that we continued. This makes everything so much more clear.
Yeah, nice. I'm glad the last 10 slides were not as bad as I thought it would be.
This actually very much intrigues me about how abstract logic may relate to Badiou's use of Grothendieck topos. It's interesting because I mean, I might be mumbling because I'm really tired, and this might not make any sense. But I think one can make a relation with here with Badiou and a kind of abductive logic tagged with pragmatism. So I don't know. I might be mumbling.
You know what amazes me is that we are struggling, or I'm struggling, I don't know about you guys, to learn this stuff and conceptualize it. And mathematicians like spend their time to understand this and conceptualize this. Badiou uses what their entire world, a tool of a different kind of discipline altogether. I mean, the fact that he makes that tool is like Einstein's usage of Riemannian space in his general relativity is of that scale.
Yeah, I think that it would be really useful. I mean, I feel like it's missing in our whole discussion on category theory, this sort of very stupid intuitive exercise, because, which I think gives credence to what you're saying, because I feel like there is a weird intuitive version of this, which is, I mean, Dennis mentioned today something that I feel like it's underdeveloped in logics of worlds, though it's clearly there. And it's clearly very, very, very strongly kind of an important idea in mathematics of the transcendental, because Badiou begins his presentation of category theory choosing a metaphor, which is the visual metaphor, the idea of seeing perspective, a sort of cinematic metaphor, right? That metaphor is not clear. I mean, he doesn't construct it, he begins from it. And I feel like it's really, really useful as an intuition. And Dennis went into this navigational metaphor, which is also clearly like very strong, it has a lot of heuristic power, and it's very nice for pragmatism as a sort of tool to think through stuff. But for example, let's say we don't have any of this, right? And we're gonna shop in a mathematics store for the useful stuff. Like what are we looking for when we're thinking about world, right? And these are, let's say, the philosophical decisions in the background, I think. Like this guy, he's saying something like, I know that there are many ways of looking at stuff. I know that looking at stuff changes. So for example, if I'm seeing something in front of me, if I change from where I see it, something must change in the thing, but at the same time, something must be preserved, right? So there must be I have two different relations to the same thing, but at the same time, there must be something that is, let's say, internally coherent, right? I think that this sort of very intuitive idea of like on both towards the object and towards the world, it's very, very powerful to think, okay, I can shift position from where I see something, and the thing must be allowed to shift. But that transformation must preserve something. So I'm looking for something that allows me to think perspectives in this very simple sense of something transforms into something else. Let's say a place transforms into another place. This must be correlated to a transformation in the object, but this must preserve a structure, right? At the same time, let's forget about the object. Let's think about the very space in general. And I want to be able to say that the trajectory that I take in a space must allow for transformation because I'm moving around. I'm seeing parts of it as I move. But if this space has structure, the history of this trajectory must capture something about the structure of the space itself.
Yeah, that's a nice way. The history. It's like sets have a history in a way, and that historical view of the set gives us a picture of the space that we're in.
Yeah,
That's the sheaf.
Yeah.
Now
Okay.
and now let's continue with this like very intuitive ideas.
Great analogies, like
But it's stupid
firecrackers.
stuff. Like, let's be very stupid about it. So, like the most idiot idea of perspective, the most idiot idea of trajectory, right? Now, let's be the most postmodern deconstructionist that we can, and
No,
say,
please go.
no, this is the Badiouian way. Like, you go through the sophist. You're not afraid of it, and you want to be able to say that this restricts first. You need to be wary of the visual metaphor. So you're not talking about anything given, because that's the postmodern condition, let's say. We need to remove all givens. So we need to have at the same time a theory where this shifts in perspective and shifts in trajectory, they're not dissociate from what you see. So we need to have, besides those two conditions we just said, looking at things from different perspectives must be transformations of perspectives and transformations in the object that preserves some structure, and taking trajectories in a space must preserve, must, let's say, gather information about the space. Now we add this very strong and complicated condition where we don't want things to be anything more than those transformations, right? We don't want to say we're walking in a space that it exists, let's say, automatic, like as is, or that has properties that are hidden from the trajectory, or that the object is there in itself beyond the perspective, right? Of course, this can lead to a highly subjectivist account. But you is going to bring us to the opposite sense, right? So, but at this point, you get this idea that so you don't want these trajectories and these transformations to be on top of something. You want them to be, the collection of them to be the space. So that's the third thing we want to be looking for in our mathematical browsing afterwards, right? Then I think that the really, let's say, crazy one is that usually people who think about perspective and local and global relations, even if they are willing to, let's say, connect these two things into one single theory, they are not really, like, that kind of scaling or resolution problem is usually treated separately. So now we have an added idea, which is, let's no longer talk simply about transformations where things are preserved, but let's imagine that some transformations don't preserve. So for example, I can get so close to something that I start losing information, like my head is near the wall.
Mm-hmm.
I'm too close, like this is not the closest perspective on the object. You're already, let's say, missing the object, right? And you can be too far away to actually see something. So you need to also include in your theory ways of changing perspective and ways of walking in the space that don't preserve the measure of that space. So
And the level of abstraction really allows for more flexibility. It's bizarre.
Yeah. So what I show, like, you see it, like this is a very intuitive idea. Like you can present it to a stupid kid. Like you want to be able to shift perspectives and things shift perspective and something is preserved. But you also want to be able to come too close and too far away to the point that you lose information, right?
Yeah. So just to draw this, like if you have some object, you want to be able, two things, you want to be able to walk around it, and no matter where you see it, you can get a consistent view, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like obviously it's a partial view. You don't see the whole object at once.
Yeah.
But you see slices of it, right? And this is what a slice category is, right? A slice category is a category that's centered around a specific object.
Yeah, but at the same time, not only via the object, but via the path, right? You want to be able to define the consistency. Let's say not with regards to the object, but with regards to the space. To say that after you did a circle, you return to the same point. That's not the same thing as seeing the object from the same perspective. Right, that's what you were talking about, the bundles and the sheaves and pre-sheaves.
Yeah, it's not necessary. It just means that you found some consistency while traveling through.
Yeah, but you see, like I think it's nice as a didactic metaphor to distinguish these two conditions because they're not the same. Mm-hmm. To say
path is
one,
the same, the object is the same.
Yeah, I want all these perspectives on the object to preserve, to be coherent, and I want that this thing here, going back to here, this also says something about the space, right? Third, I want to be able to to have a measure of what is a distance that preserves information, and further away than this and closer than this, it doesn't. That's the atomic logic, right?
Yeah. And it's interesting because the way you put it, it's quite intuitive. Like Reza was saying, that it's impressive, and it is that. But you reaches out to do all this contemporary mathematical machinery in order to do this. But when you think of it, it's almost like the same properties that traditional subjectivist phenomenology was after.
Yes,
Like,
but and now comes the two things that are the, but we decided three conditions that are, let's say, very intuitive phenomenologically, right?
like
Perspective.
you want to integrate the adumbrations of the object. You want to have a guarantee that it is the same object. Like these were all present in traditional phenomenology, which is interesting. Yeah.
And then you add two new ones that are the crazy ones. The first crazy one is what is valid for sensible world is valid for logical and intelligible world. Like that's not a regular phenomenology, right? So the same things that apply for looking at a visual, an object in your visual space, apply for looking at an n-dimensional structure in a mathematical theory, or apply for talking about capital and political economy. Like you want this whole thing to be the same machinery to be applicable to all these different, let's say, ideas of perspective and consistency.
To sensible contents and to conceptual contents as well. In a sense.
Yeah, it makes no distinction. If we're going around a set of numbers and taking slices from the real numbers and asking about how they glue together given the slices that we took, like Dedekind cuts and things like this, and about the consistency of the real number line, it's the same machinery. So that's the first crazy thing. And it until very recently, and no wonder that it's, I mean, Rez, I don't know if you've heard this, but you know that in 1967, Badiou was already saying that category theory was going to be
so he was structures in that book about his the book that was published, Badiou and like the origins of French philosophy.
He already talks about it there.
Yeah, he already talks about it. Yeah.
So I mean, up until very recently, there was no mathematical theory that would treat logic as space in this way, right? So to meet this fourth condition that we're talking about, we need such a generalized theory of transformation that it would cover topology and all sorts of groups, ring structures, and things like this, and with the same machinery, right? And then there is the fifth condition, which I think is also the last one, which is, let's say, what makes him a materialist, right? Is that all of this must be able to be intrinsically definable of a space and not of someone visiting a space, right? So what I think ultimately makes this materialist is that all these properties can be assigned to the consistency of the object and not to your visitation of the object. So ultimately, you can define the objects themselves as being the set of all transformations that preserve its perspectives and its place in a space composed of other objects, right?
Yeah, so, This is kind of the Yoneda thing as well. I mean, in some sense. Yeah, I mean, not exactly, but yeah, it's basically this, like, when he talks about the postulate of materialism.
Yeah, I mean, this is
kind of that.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to think when you presented the Yoneda lemma. My first impression was that this is actually very, very, very weird because it's saying that arrows. I mean, the whole thing with the bundle spaces are like arrows to something capture all the information about that thing, right?
Yeah.
So this is that idea is the opposite of a subjectivist one, where we usually think arrows from something capture all the information about, right? I mean, the idea that all possible perspectives on something, that's that thing, right? It's like
that is that thing.
Yeah, that's the crazy idea. Like you're talking with this postmodern relativist, and he's saying there are only perspectives, and then you pull his carpet by saying, let's now agree to define an object as all the category of all perspectives on that thing. Suddenly you got back to an objectivist discussion.
It's just a slight shift. You just say, okay, then let's count that as the object now.
Yeah, it's like the subjective relativist. He's a pre-objectivist, right? In the sense
Yeah, exactly. He's a stepping stone to the objective viewpoint. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, it's really weird because of course it's like a ridiculous machinery, but this is, I think, that the thing that he's so interested in, the idea that you can, this kind of intuitive ideas plus, so on perspective, trajectory, and resolution, plus two conditions that are, let's say, one comes from Marxism on materialism, and the other comes from Platonism on not making a qualitative distinction between sensible and intelligible or conceptual worlds, right? Once you get those 5 conditions, this machinery fits it.
Mm-hmm.
It's really
Perspective,
weird.
trajectory, resolution, materialism, and
Perspective,
well,
right?
Platonic thinking and being is the same.
Yeah, they're all there. Like, and there you have a Marxist Platonic perspectivist theory with, but it, which is compatible with pragmatism, which is the most crazy.
Which is compatible with pragmatism. We should create a new Marxist-Leninist party with all these attributes.
But I don't know. It's really. I totally agree with Reza. It's. I mean, it's mind blowing that you can actually find these things cohering in a theory, right? And I think that for me the really counterintuitive one is the Platonic one, right? That
Well, the first 3 is really coming from category theory, right? The first 3 is coming from category theory.
No, it's not coming from. They are like the most normal phenomenological ones.
No,
Like,
I know, but they are. What I'm saying is that. Oh, you are saying that the motivation, he already had those motivation before. Yeah. Okay, I see. But they are preserved within, I mean, the what did you say? Perspective, trajectory, and resolution is all, are all parts bundled in category theory. Don't you agree?
No, totally. All of them are.
Well, I don't know. Well, materialism and Platonism, no, it's coming from philosophy. I mean, there is nothing in category theory that says anything that we are saying is.
No, there is. Category theory is the theory of generalizing stuff that we're like homotopy stuff for topology, so that it's also valid for other stuff and vice versa. Like this integration between topology and logic.
Understood, but even the statement that you just said is a statement made by philosophy.
No, it's made by Grothendieck.
What's the statement?
That you can actually treat mathematical structures in a very generalized way as topology.
No, I understand, but still topology is a mathematical object. So it's an interdisciplinary statement. But the fact that, or at least the way I understand the Platonist part, is that what category theory says, which is the way of thinking is no different than the way of being, is not what category theory says. Is what is not interdisciplinary, is outer-disciplinary.
Yeah, I just don't see such a qualitative distinction between the first 3 ones about philosophical phenomenology, because they deal with perspective, trajectory, things like this, which are all, let's say, they could restrict us to perception, sensibility, things like this, like extensional stuff, temporal
we
stuff.
can perhaps talk about this more, because the materialism postulate and the Platonic postulates are postulates that are added to.
Yeah, we didn't get to that point. Like none of these 5 conditions include the postulate of materialism yet. Right? I would say that the postulate of materialism is accounting for another restriction, which is a further one later on. But like at this level of
So what was the fourth one then?
is that we must be able to have a theory where logical spaces and topological spaces are, we can treat them with the same machinery or with a homogeneous machinery.
Oh, I see.
So for example, things that present whose structure is spatial and temporal, right? And things whose structure is purely logical. We want a machinery that allows us to talk about perspectives and trajectories in both.
Mm-hmm. So you basically, you're saying that, well, this is fascinating stuff. This is a topic for a book.
A book was written. That's the best part.
Yeah, we're reading it.
We are reading.
Just one more thing I wanted to say. A cool thing I just saw in this.
No, I'm
picture.
I thought that he was referring to my book. Because this is like, basically, this is redefining what are the basic postulates of the discipline that logics of words is living in.
Yeah, but I think that for me, I mean, I think that he starts from the idea that we want to define worlds without subjects. So he doesn't really give you an intuitive presentation of phenomenology with subject and then removes it, which would be, let's say, the rhetorical thing that we just did, right?
What is this railing, Dennis? You drew some railing.
It's the trolley problem in a Mobius band.
Yeah, it's just I was just thinking before I said that you make a circle and you come back and see the same set again, same object. But actually, if your space is a Mobius strip, right, you could come back once and you would actually see a different set. It would take 2 trips,
yeah,
right? A Mobius strip, you need to make 2 trips to get back to the starting point. So that's a non-trivial example of how the space you're in affects the consistency of the object, right?
Yeah.
You might think you're not in a consistent space because you made a circle and you looked at it and you're like, this thing changed, so I must not be in a consistent space. But if you were to just go one more time, you would see, the space you're in is Mobius. And
yeah, that's why I think the perspective and the trajectory should be thought as 2 conditions and not 1, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But I don't know. I think that this is a nice intuitive way about it, and I think that it's so powerful when you get to move. I mean, because let's say you have a rationalist perspectivism that usually is a bit too much centered on, let's say, sensible worlds like perception, mind, and sensibility, and you have this sort of new perspectivism that comes from Nietzsche and so on, that is more like value-like, more logical-like, right? So you could talk about different perspectives, give different value weights to stuff, to the point that they are incompatible. So you usually have to choose between, let's say, the vitalist perspectivism and the rationalist one. Rationalist one, which is trying to, let's say, account for minds, perception, cognition, and so on. And you have a sort of vitalist perspectivism of life, right? Of life worlds as being totally disjoint. Depending on how you see your world, you're in a different place and things are totally different and so on. And this 5 conditions we discussed, they conjoin the 2, right?
Mm-hmm.
For example, I think that would be, that there is to go back to Karatani that we've been talking about, in reciprocity.
I was waiting for that.
Yeah, I was avoiding it just not to be, but in Karatani, there is this idea of reciprocity as being this weird I-thou relation, right? So for example, if you have someone here and someone here, I relate to you, like if I give you something, it's not like I relate to it, like to an object. I relate to somebody who can have a perspective on me, right? So for example, this goes to a really weird place in Amerindian cosmovision, because they say, for example, that a human sees, like, we see a jaguar as an animal, right? So I'm the human and the jaguar is the animal, right? Or the non-human. But the jaguar sees me as an animal and itself as a human, right? So for example, we could talk about this exactly as a Mobian space. Like from if you give one turn, you see it where you are the human on this side and the animal is on this side.
Yeah.
Right, but if you take another turn, it inverts.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And someone is looking at you.
Yeah, so the human is looking at you and not you looking at the animal, right? Like, so
yeah, exactly. It's like a non-trivial reciprocity.
Yeah, reciprocity is already weird. Like,
yeah,
the symmetry in reciprocity is actually a condition for things not to be, like, the fact that they're symmetrical means that you are not mapped by the other in the same way that you mapped it, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that the map, that you just get a bijection there. It means that you get, like, these things don't superimpose. So just trying to show that this is, like, those 5 conditions we were talking about, they add up to a really, really kind of powerful matrix for both of these views, you know? And I think that this very intuitive, stupid approach is kind of presupposed in the first draft of his stuff with category theory. Like, I always ask myself, how did he come up with this idea that stuff sees stuff? Like, where did he get the idea that the visual metaphor is a good idea? Like, nobody writes in this way, like, so clearly, you know? Even though there are many metaphors, visual metaphors in category theory, like lenses and things like this. But I think that this is, like, a good way to reconstruct it in a way that makes it look much clearer.
Yeah, we should definitely write a text on this.
Agreed. And I also think that this helps to clarify why the Yoneda lemma is so crazy. Like,
okay, guys.
Okay, I insist that we write a text, but a text that
the
talks
party
about
of the perspective trajectory, the perspective pragmatist Platonic Marxist.
Platonic Marxism, that's the name of the party.
Unified.
Little Red Book.
Very important predicate.
Little Red Book of Category Theory would be the name.
The unified party of the unified Platonist, Marxist, and pragmatists in objective phenomenology.
Yeah. Yeah, man, but this was really,
We
really
are objectively allies now.
Yes, exactly.
Like in the Stalinist sense. but objectively allies. Only objective allies.
Dennis, you promised to turn on your video. You didn't.
Yeah, I was thinking about that.
People are walking around, so I just have it off.
Guys, I need to run.
Yeah, me too.
Thanks a lot, Dennis.
Dennis, this was amazing.
It was amazing.
Yeah,
thank you, guys. It helped me too. Yeah, it's good that all this stuff was actually connected after all.
Man,
I wasn't really sure at the beginning.
No, it was really connected. And I think we should also praise, after many, many sessions of torture with me writing on screen, how is it that Dennis can write so clearly using his mouse? Like, I feel so jealous.
I learned from many hours of pain watching you.
Yes.
It was a painful education, but I learned it.
This is such an amazing tool, Dennis. I downloaded it. I use it while I read these texts.
Yeah, it's really useful. Yeah, the journal. You guys should get it.
Okay.
Great, guys.
See you guys.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye, guys.